don't think anything makes me feel more like a boomer than knowing there are young fans out there who don't even know what Final Fantasy Versus XIII is at this point. But these trailers were the ultimate fascination of my teen years. The original concept for the game, now known as Final Fantasy XV, was led by Kingdom Hearts director Tetsuya Nomura, until it wasn't. After 7 years of various development difficulties and trying to make a game for this godforsaken machine, just when the project was finally getting back on track, Nomura had to be removed from the project to work on the long overdue Kingdom Hearts 3 and the long demanded Final Fantasy VII remake. However, it's been long speculated, or maybe I should say observable, that Nomura wasn't too happy about the state of Final Fantasy XV. In a 2018 interview, he had this to say on the matter: "When I was starting as a developer, like I wasn't an industry veteran yet, when I was creating Final Fantasy titles with Mr. Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, at that time he said that Final Fantasy is a game that has everything in it. I don't think there are many people left in Square that have actually worked with him on Final Fantasy. Of course, Final Fantasy is still continuing on. They are still committing to pushing out titles. But when I started creating Kingdom Hearts, that was when I kind of had a time away from Final Fantasy. And of course, I am still working on a Final Fantasy title right now. But it was at a time when I was not working on a Final Fantasy title and I realized what Sakaguchi-san said about Final Fantasy, that it is a game that incorporates everything to Kingdom Hearts. So I brought that idea to Kingdom Hearts. Currently looking at the newer Final Fantasy titles, to be honest, I don't think it really incorporates that idea of having everything. That last part is interesting, isn't it? He doesn't think newer Final Fantasy titles incorporate the idea of having everything. Makes you wonder which Final Fantasy game he was talking about. It's doubtful he was talking about the, at the time, unreleased Final Fantasy VII remake that he was directing, possibly Final Fantasy XIII, but very doubtfully so. This comment almost undeniably seems about the state of Final Fantasy XV. Since then, Versus XIII has made its way into Nomura's ideas, but most prominently in the form of Verum Rex and Kingdom Hearts 4, with KH4 in particular absolutely doubling down on what Remind did. This connection with Final Fantasy Versus XIII goes much deeper than lol, they both take place in a city. If you haven't seen my other videos regarding Verum Rex, I highly recommend checking them out at some point, as everything has led up to this point. Just like everything has led you to hit the subscribe button so the channel can hit 90k for its 5th anniversary. This is a fantasy based on reality. These words have been an essential concept to Versus XIII since the very beginning. Funny enough, even the font and animation used between these two trailers is pretty similar. Not only that, but also the sound effect is quite similar as well. A fantasy based on reality is also a concept that seems rooted in Kingdom Hearts 4. Sora, an anime fantasy character, finds himself in reality, namely the city of Quadratum. Taking the shape of this world, Sora notably looks more realistic in his facial proportions, hair, and overall rendering. In previous videos, we've discussed that Yozora's rendering wasn't at all like that of Kingdom Hearts characters as we had come to know them, but rather more like the realistic anime hybrids that we've seen in the Final Fantasy series. Stylistically, Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts normally have their own separate styles, but this is closer to a Final Fantasy game than a Kingdom Hearts one. When starting the trailer, you notice an oddly familiar melody. In Kingdom Hearts 3's Secret Ending, a song whose motif blended somberness from Versus and 15, with iconic Kingdom Hearts track Dearly Beloved, plays in the background. The musical references here in terms of audio continue even further, with the opening of the song sounding eerily similar to that of the E3 2013 trailer for Versus the 15. Of course, given the fact that he recreated this scene 1-for-1 shot for shot in the KH3 Remind finale, it's safe to say that this is likely the intent. Starting off with this apartment here, which reminds me of artwork for Noctis' apartment, in which of course he's also sleeping. He wakes up to notice that the girl from the Kingdom Hearts mobile game is in the room with him. Sora immediately freaks out because he's played all of them except for that one. But the significance of Sora sleeping and then waking up in another reality is what's important here. It draws parallels to the original concept of Noctis, whose dreams were of great significance and allowed him to sort of peer into alternate realities. While the significance of this was trimmed down in the final product of 15, surprisingly enough, this idea still exists and is actually still canon. The most immediate example would be the Platinum demo, in which a young Noctis experiences an exaggerated reality. This concept is also used in the main game during Chapter 8, where Noctis dreams of the Omen trailer, for no real reason, actually. I mean, I'm sure there was one, but it was cut from the final product of the game with this dream sequence still left in for some reason. And they just kind of never explain why either, they just leave it there. It's there and it's never brought up or mentioned. Noctis just has a bad dream that looks like a very high production CGI trailer, and then that's it. And shockingly, this isn't even the last time we see Noctis' ability to dream of alternate realities. As mentioned in the cancelled DLC turned novel Final Fantasy XV Dawn of the Future, Noctis dreams of an alternate reality of Final Fantasy Versus XIII. If you're curious about this part of the book, I've made a whole video on it, and you can find a link for it in the description below. But isn't it interesting that Sora here also finds himself with sleep leading to an alternate reality? Then there's Stella, not to be confused with Stella, or Stella before it was cool. But whether you want to call her Strelitzia, Stella, or Mobile Game Girl, they all point back to Versus 13 with the same symbolism. Sora, loosely resembling Noctis' silhouette, wears black clothes, and a girl that symbolizes that of a star greets him, wearing of course all white, as white dresses are often used to symbolize Stella. However, it's what she says that I find most interesting. In the English version of the script, she refers to this place as an afterworld, as in a place where people go when they die. The Japanese version is a little bit more explicit, as it refers to it as Shin no Sekai, which means world of the dead. This is an incredibly essential clue when it comes to connecting KH4 and Versus 13. For starters, Noctis and Stella are said to have received a great power from the goddess Etro, the goddess of death, who grants this power through a near-death experience. They're also able to see a light in the sky, which comes from the realm of the dead. And now here we are in Quadratum, a place that is also described to be the realm of the dead. Quadratum is undeniably based on Insomnia from Final Fantasy Versus XIII, which is based on the same areas of Tokyo. Now let's take that word Quadratum for a second. It means square, but it also represents the number 4. You may think this is just a cheeky connection to this being Kingdom Hearts 4, but this place being referred to as Shin no Sekai goes a bit deeper into having cultural significance in Japan. In Japanese, 4 or shi sounds like shinu, which means death. Because of this, 4 in Japanese culture oftentimes represents death. Just like how the number 13 can be treated in Western culture, in some buildings, rooms and levels skip the number 4, particularly in hospitals and hotels. This particularly applies to the maternity section of hospitals, with the number 43, as saying 4, shi, and 3, san, can together be read like shizan, which is the word for stillbirth. Yeah, that one took me for a loop too. But all of this is to make the point that Kingdom Hearts 4, just like Final Fantasy Versus XIII, is really centered around the concept of death a lot. And in the case of Final Fantasy Versus XIII, these ties go deeper as well, not just in the goddess Etro and how she symbolized death, but even the fact that Lucius, to which Quadratum draws parallels from, was a nation that worshipped death, even having a skull on their flag, their national color being black, and Noctis and many other royal affiliates having crossbone designs on their clothing, something that Yozora has on his clothes as well, though made appropriate for Kingdom Hearts. And the references don't end there. You may have noticed D-Eater and D-Dream, but if you look closer at this shot, there's also a sign that says Fabula Books. This is undoubtedly a reference to Fabula Nova Crystallis, the mythos of which Final Fantasy Versus XIII belonged to. Visually speaking, there is also a lot of overlap with Versus XIII. The general color grading of Quadratum reminds me of Insomnia. The Keyblade hookshot mechanically functions the same as warp striking. The scene where Sora runs up and down these buildings also has a cinematic resemblance to certain Versus XIII trailers. But even with all of these connections, Kingdom Hearts 4 likely cannot be Final Fantasy Versus XIII, a game whose story was often thought to be too dark even for mainline Final Fantasy. It's hard to imagine this being a full retelling of that story in any given way due to the restrictions that Kingdom Hearts has placed onto it by Disney and the fact that it's also its own separate story as well. But there's clearly some kind of intent here, judging by the dedication to the references. It's hard to describe what this connection will ultimately climax into or what this symbolism all means. But for now, we can say, in some capacity, in some way, in some shape or form, Versus XIII lives. Shout out to Jonathan Wedge and the rest of the Ultima community.